75 years ago, the world was coming out of the worst conflict in human history. To mark the beginning of a new era of global cooperation, the United Nations was formed. Its mission to mobilize the world to tackle its most pressing challenges like the deadliest pandemic in a century. The UN General Assembly recently convened its 75th session as the death toll from the coronavirus neared 1 million. Facing the greatest crisis since the very war the UN was born from, the global body has been criticized for its inability to act. Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that the UN had failed to respond adequately to the pandemic. He also singled out its failure to end conflicts and help those fleeing oppression in places like Syria, Yemen, and Libya. So has the UN outgrown its usefulness? Has the rapid spread and devastation by the coronavirus exposed the need for real reforms? And to answer that, from Istanbul, I'm joined by Talha Kose, who is an associate professor of political science and international relations at Ibn Haldun University. And from Rome, Marco Carnelos, who is Italy's former ambassador to the United Nations. Gentlemen, welcome to Straight Talk. It's good to have you on the program. At the virtual meeting of the 75th UNGA, coronavirus pandemic, tensions between the US and China, and regional conflicts dominated the agenda. So, Marco, could you walk us through this year's meeting and how it was different than the previous ones?
Well, it was quite different because nobody was there. And it's quite a big difference in the sense that the pandemic compelled everybody to be connected with the UN in remote, as millions and millions, maybe billions of people are accustoming themselves because of the pandemic to work on remote. Even the top leaders of the planet have been compelled to be connected from remote inside the UN building. When I've been many times in the early 2000s, I have to rectify, I was not an ambassador, I was one of the top official on the Middle East at the Italian mission at the UN. And there's a very, very limited number of people. Social distancing is affecting also inside the UN building, as we can see from the images, and the mask. And everything has changed. And a small virus coming
in a good way or in a bad way, you think?
Well, listen, the pandemic has been something very, very cruel in a way, because there are so many people affected, there's so many economies disrupted. There's only one small good effect in the sense that people are traveling less, are polluting less, in a way are staying more inside with their families. I don't want to say that this is it's good at all, but in a way there's also a positive effect. What is important is to take the right lessons from this situation and improve, reinforce multilateralism and international cooperation. So if we will not be able to do that in these circumstances, I mean, in this way, the world leaders are failing.
We're going to touch on multilateralism, but Talha, one of Turkish President Erdogan's most popular slogans has been that the world is bigger than five, meaning that the UN Security Council, with its 5 members, is outdated and unable to tackle the problems of today's world. So has the UN's weakness during the pandemic proved his point?
Yes, exactly. I mean, there are so many problems within the United Nations system, and one of the issues definitely is the configuration of the Security Council. However, besides the Security Council, there is declining interest and declining trust in the United Nations system. So we have been engaging, dealing with the problem of the pandemic. We have been dealing with the environmental issues, global warming. So now the global leaders, especially the founders of the United Nations, and the permanent members of the Security Council are no more committed to United Nations. So Trump's talk was just 8 minutes, and he mentioned the American interest, and he just threatened the countries that the U.S. has been facing problems. So actually, this should be the ground for multilateralism and engaging with the global crisis that affects all the people. The similar situation for Putin's talk and Xi's talk. So unfortunately, the leaders, rather than emphasizing the multilateralism and cooperation and reforming the United Nations for the purpose of future problems, they mentioned their country's own interest. And this is a frightening issue because the number of problems they have been dealing are increasing. So the immigration issue, global warming, and all these problems are mounting, and there is less commitment, especially from the leaders that established this organization.
Yeah, it just previously mentioned, Marco, during the early stages of the pandemic, many countries were acting unilaterally to combat the virus, whether it was buying supplies or sharing information. So why do you think the United Nations failed to take a leading role in providing a multilateral platform for countries to cooperate?
There's a big misunderstanding here. I listen many times expression like United Nations failed. We should take into account that the United Nations works only when the 5 permanent members of United Nations allow the organization to work.
Yes.
But because of their rivalries, there's nothing the UN can do if the 5 permanent members of the Security Council disagree among themselves. So the reform of Security Council to be more reflecting better the current international reality is overdue. It's overdue since they are discussing the topic since at least 30 years, since the early 90s. Mm-hmm. Of course, there's disagreement. There are some countries, some big countries now in the international stage that may be because of their economy, their political role, their population would have much more rights or to say something more meaningful about international peace and security. That is one of the main topics of United Nations. There are other issues that United Nations is covering, humanitarian issue, development, where the organization has been effective all along the last decades. Where it has failed, it's on peace of security, but because peace of security is linked perversely to what the Security Council decides according to the will of 5 permanent members that are there since 1945.
Mm-hmm. But many leaders around the world, Talha, want there should be structural reforms to the United Nations. If there are going to be structural reforms, who would oversee them? Who will decide? The UN Security Council again?
I think
it would not.
Talha, please.
And the main ground should be the UN General Assembly. However, we don't see enthusiasm, especially from the permanent members in the General Assembly. So they do not really try to open the gate for reforms, especially the influential countries. And there are some other initiatives coming from Germany, Brazil, India. They are also, disturbed from the current situation and dysfunctional nature of the United Nations. Despite there are some achievements in humanitarian areas, in NGOs and coordination in some areas, the main political problem, actually, the main political issues and dealing with the violent conflict has not been touched in a proper manner. So there is actually an interest, there is some, efforts to integrate new actors in a more effective way. However, there is a resistance. So it should be tackled in the General Assembly, but General Assembly does not have that many powers for the moment.
So, Marco, how could Trump's re-election impact the United Nations? Because we already know that he cut off funding for the WHO, UNESCO, he threatened NATO allies, he withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement. So what could his re-election mean for multilateralism?
Well, first of all, we have to see if he will be re-elected first. Secondly, unfortunately, I believe that we are not going to know who is going to be the president of the United States on the evening or early morning of November 3rd, because the result could be highly contested by both sides. Yes. Third, and we could have months before knowing who is going to be the American president, who the American people decided as president. My hope is that once Trump is reelected, he will relax a little bit maybe will become a little bit more cooperative because now he has achieved what he was looking for, and maybe he will consider that some form of multilateralism, effective multilateralism, will be much more helpful to solve some of the most important problems in the planet, starting from the pandemic, of course, but also to promote the condition for more peace and security in the Middle East, hopefully not in the way that he's doing currently, especially against the Palestinians. And at the same time, I believe that also the issue of climate change could be resumed in a very cooperative way between the top, let's say, polluters in the world. In this sense, I believe that the cooperation between the United States and China and other Asian countries is extremely important with the European Union to try to see if at least climate change is an issue that could be discussed again with some more effective measures.
All right. Unfortunately, gentlemen, we'll have to leave it here. Thank you very much for joining us on Straight Talk.